mimic the lithology. So here we have an alternating facies with different mechanical units. So the environment gives the fracture pattern. Now, in the same area about the porosity and P wave. So here we have porosity. Here we have P wave. We have drastically different answers. In the slope, the porosity is very high, and the P wave are quite low. In the platform, the porosity is very little, so often tight. The P wave are very high. So that means that in the single mechanical unit, we have low porosity, high VP, and it's tight and fractured. And we have no interfaces. And in the slope, we have distinct mechanical units, strong interfaces, and high porosity, especially located in the mud, in microporous space, and strong interfaces. So we can say here that the fractures, they depend on early diagenesis and on depositional environment. And here the fractures and the pattern of the fracture is not at all related to tectonics, nothing to do with tectonics. The third example now is Murgia. So in Murgia, we have outcrops of here, it's lower Cretaceous, just topped by outcrops in upper Cretaceous. The facies are identical. They are close together, so they had about the same geodynamic history. And you can look on these pictures here that the fracture pattern is about similar. So we have very homogeneous carbonates with little bedding. And here you see that the bedding is enhanced by stylolites, and we have quite diffuse fractures. Here it's just a little bit denser, but more or less it's the same. In between both units, we have a small unconformity with a hiatus, a small gap. In between, there was a little bit of tectonic compression. But the big difference is that in the lower Cretaceous, we had northeast, southwest oriented extension with vertical sigma 1, and here it's more east-west. So when these lower Cretaceous deposited, the stress was a little bit different compared to the upper Cretaceous. And this is visible in the fracture pattern. I mean, the fracture pattern in the lower Cretaceous is oblique to the one in the upper Cretaceous. So what can we infer from this? One more element. So the burial curve, they have about the same burial with a little bit more burial for the lower Cretaceous, but it's the same history. And they have one single brittle event. Wherever we are, the lower Cretaceous has one brittle event and the upper Cretaceous has one brittle event, which is surprising because you can imagine that if this is early diagenesis, it occurred before, and when this is fractured, it should create a second event of fracture in the lower rocks. This is not the case. And with this information, we know that these were formed during early Cretaceous and these were formed during late Cretaceous. So it's two tectonic events. And the second one did not affect lower Cretaceous. So what do we infer from this? We infer that as soon as the rocks are brittle, they fail with the ambient stress pattern. They are vertical due to vertical sigma 1, and then they orient more or less depending on sigma 2. And just after, the system is locked, like in Provence. And then if you have another pile of carbonates on top, very early they will break again with the new stress pattern, so they can be a little bit different. So it's fantastic for us because it's like if you take a picture of your journey, you know, the fractures are like a witness, a picture of the stress at that time. And evolving with time, the carbonate will record the stress pattern evolving with time also. So this is why carbonates can be a golden peak. So this is just a summary of all what we saw about this phases and diagenetic control. I think it's fine when I switch to the next one. Yes? Okay. So now we can use them as golden peaks. So it's kind of picture of the ambient stress pattern. And that's what I did, and I tried to do in a folded area. So the strategy was using the fracture sequence in carbonates to decipher the long and complex history of a reservoir and reservoir properties. And so I did it in Provence in a fold. So we are here in Provence. This is the fold here. And this is a deep section. Here we have a deep borehole. And we can see that there is a ramp beneath, giving rise to this fold, which is quite complicated. And this is a very good analog fold, for instance, for the Foreland first belt of the Andes. In Bolivia, for instance, I don't know if you work in Bolivia. This is an analog for Incahuasi reservoirs. So the shape of the fold is quite complicated. The stratigraphy is here. So we have middle Jurassic, upper Jurassic here, and a little bit of Cretaceous on top, but we don't see it very well. So it's from slope to basin carbonates and going up to platform carbonates. What did we survey? So along the fold, we did a long scan line. That means that we started from here, you see the scale, and along about 2 kilometers, we measured every single fracture. It's a lot of work. In the vertical limb, in the hinge, and in the flat limb to the south. And we measured everything, fractures, stellolites, faults, bedding, everything. So these are the data very quickly. So all the beddings, stellolites due to burial or tectonics, joints, tension gashes and veins, and any faults. So in the joints, we separated the tension gashes like this from the barren joints, empty, and the cemented joints and veins. In the faults, we could decipher some rare normal faults in sedimentary, strike slip faults, small reverse faults like here, huge reverse faults like here in the north limb, bed parallel reverse faults due to bed parallel slip, and also very early ramps which are tilted together with the bedding. That's not the end. Burial stellolites, like here, and also tectonic stellolites. So here you see tectonic stellolites on thin sections, on cores also. So what do we do with all that stuff? I won't explain everything, but this is only one example to create a sequence where here we have burial stellolites. Here we have a vein here, which looks to either cut the stellolite or the stellolite stop and restart it here. And then we have a tectonic stylolite here, which cuts the previous one. So couple after couple of structures, we could build a sequence, and the sequence was tested with the fold test. I mean, how is it before folding and how is it after folding? So this is the present day projection of the structures. For instance, they are tectonic stylolites with the bedding here, and this is the back tilted structure, and you see that all stylolites are horizontal. So that means that the tectonic stylolite started to make pressure solution at the onset of the folding. So we did the test with all the structures, and at the end we end up with a kind of table. So this is a relative scale before folding, during folding, or after folding. And on this line, we have the joints and the veins. On this line, we have the stylolites, boreal, tectonic, and on this line, we have the folds, normal, strike slip, reverse, and so on. Early ramps, bed parallel, slip, and so on. And based on this, we can now compare to the loading uplift path of the rocks. So this is the time when the rocks deposited, and this is today. And the idea is to compare each time the state of the rocks in this diagram. This diagram is a Nelson diagram. This guy decided to classify the reservoirs depending on the matrix. Here on the permeability, porosity, fixed porosity. It's either 100% due to the matrix or due to the fractures. And on that side, it's permeability, either due to matrix or fractures. And we can decipher 4 types of reservoirs. So at the beginning of the history, we had the burial. And at that time, the fractures T1 and the burial stylolites ST1 and the normal faults developed. So that means that the reservoir started to have fracture porosity and permeability. But the fractures, they are cemented. So the permeability and porosity of fracture increased and immediately decreased because the fractures were cemented. The fluid from the stylolites went into the fractures, so we reduced the porosity. But we may have some remaining porosity in the fractures, so the permeability is not 0. So it comes back here. And at the next step, we start the folding. So we start to have some strike slip folds, other veins due to folding, and some ramps. So we have more fractures and folds, so the permeability and porosity increase again. But then we have diagenesis in the fractures, so the porosity decreases, permeability also, but not to 0. Next step is the intense folding. So with the intense folding, we have bed parallel folds, we have tectonic stylolites, we have horizontal tension gauges, and a lot of reverse folds. So we have again an increase in permeability and porosity, and after diagenesis, again a little decrease. Last phase, in that stage, we had here erosion, some calcification, and deposition of tertiary on top of it. So here is also another history which you probably know better, because at that time there was hypokarst and epikarst. Okay, so we have both kind of karst, but they are still studied at the moment. So with a simple survey, with only 2,000 or 3,000 measurements, you we can do a nice reservoir history. So the conclusion is that curvature cannot serve alone for fracture accurate modeling in reservoirs. And now, what about fracture corridors? You know, probably a lot of corridors along folds or faults, but the corridors also occur in the middle of nowhere. And this is a big problem for underground reservoirs, because when there's a corridor or several corridors in a reservoir, it's only bullshit. They can close it. They will get water very quickly. So the way we used to think about corridors. So this is Latemar in a Dolomite in Italy. Vincenzo has been in this field to help my PhD students to take measurements. So he's been doing scan lines also for hours and hours. And he started a PhD on fractures anyway. So we see the corridors as highways for fluids. So we used to think that they were related to faults and faults. And we thought that there was a clear difference between the mechanical stratigraphy for corridors and the mechanical stratigraphy for fractures. We used to think that there are different stories. And we used to think that there is really a hierarchy or imbrication pattern between bed confined fractures and fracture corridors. So it's not completely wrong, but it's not completely true neither. So what are corridors? You see a corridor here. So here you have diffuse fractures, and suddenly you have hundreds of fractures restricted, constrained in a corridor. So what controls the occurrence and their geometry? We don't really know. What makes the difference between diffuse fracture occurrence and corridor occurrence? We still do not really know. There are some modeling, but it's still unclear, and mechanicians have no answer. Can we deduce the genetic laws that for corridors occurrence? Till now we have ideas, but it's still a challenge. And how far facies and straightenomy and diagenesis influence corridors? We've seen it on fractures. Is it the same on corridors? So for this, I have a couple of answers. I did a study in Bolivia, so it's not far from here. Here, more or less, is Brazil. And it's the fold and thrust of the Andes. And as I told you previously, we have here Incahuasi fold, and there are a lot of reservoirs there, and they are full of corridors. So I've been studying corridors in the field here close to Sucre. So this is more or less the geological settings, but the corridors there, I made an exception, are in clastics, in sandstones. So, okay. I also make mistakes sometimes. The geological settings are very simple. So there are ramps with bottom decollement and then ramps here that form folds, a little bit eroded. And I studied the brown color, which is the Devonian. This is the Wamapampa that contains the oil in the area. And so this fold here, the Eagle-House incline, is here on the map. It's very nice because we have outcrops to the west and outcrops to the east, so that we can make the fold test for to date the structures. What I saw is that, like on this outcrop, we have some corridors, small ones here, and we have diffuse fractures, and fractures and corridor occur before folding. So they have the same timing, more or less. They are perpendicular to the bedding. They are from either east-west sets, like here, or two subconjugate sets, like here, or both. And they have the same trend for large corridors, small corridors, diffuse fractures, or big corridors. So every fracture has parallel sets. And this is the fold test. So here it's a present day fracture position. And this is back tilted on both sides. That means that they formed before folding. And now, what about the size? So what was surprising is that corridors occur at all scales. So these are the pictures, and these are the same pictures with the corridors emphasized with the green. So this is 100 meters. So you have a full corridor going through here a weaker bed. This is 10 meters, and we have here a corridor. This is 1 meter, and this is a corridor, and this is 10 centimeters. So we can have corridors even in a single bed. Corridors are sensitive to the mechanical stratigraphy. So this is the picture, and this is the interpretation. Here we have coarse-grained beds and fine-grained beds and coarse-grained beds. And you see that here is a corridor. It disappears more or less in the fine-grained bed, but then it reappears. And then when we look at this detail in the coarse grain, you see that there are some bedding here, and the corridors abut against the main interface. And we see also that at even a smaller scale, we have at the same location bed-confined fractures, multi-bed fractures, and corridors. So every type of fracture occur everywhere synchronously, and it looks like there's no specific control on the location. So we can deduce that the corridors reflect the stratonomy. So like here, depending on the type of laminations or bedding, thin, thick, oblique, we have a different shape of the corridor. Or here we have kind of tree shape, and the tree starts at each bedding interface. So the fracture corridors cross through heterogeneous stratigraphic boundaries, and the stratigraphic arrangement changes vertically, and the fracture corridors reflect the stratonomy. And here, this is another example where you can see here the corridor is wider in coarse-grained beds and very thinner, almost one single fracture in thin-grained plastics. So there's really a dependence on of the bed width depending on the thickness and lithology of the plastics. Another example. So these are a picture from top, and there's a level at the bottom here, which is here in gray, and observation at the top here, which is here in light gray. On the top, we see a lot of corridors, and here are the main trains. And at the bottom here, or here, there's a clear difference, and there's a decoupling level, and the trends are completely different. Here we have more or less conjugate, and here they are perpendicular. That means that we have a complete detachment due to the stratigraphy. Now the loading path. This is completely different from carbonates. The grainstones, they will not be brittle immediately. They take a long time to get brittle. And in the Wamapampa sandstones, it took a long time before subsidence. And in these sandstones, we have conjugate corridors. But conjugate corridors means 60 degrees between two sets. And in that case, sigma 1 is in this angle, is a bisectrix of the angle. So when they are vertical and at 60 degrees, how is sigma 1? It's not vertical anymore. It's horizontal. That means that the corridors were formed at the onset of the Andean orogeny. So the rocks were deposited in the Devonian. Nothing occurred. Then it has been a little bit buried, and the corridors formed at depths, late, very late, just before the tectonic inversion and just before the folding. So this makes a big difference with the carbonates, because these are corridors in Provence, and in the carbonates, the corridors form immediately at low depths, and they are perpendicular with a vertical sigma 1. So the geodynamic conditions are different, but the morphology are the same. This is a corridor in carbonates of the Middle East, in Oman. So you have a corridor here in the carbonates. Here's a weak rock, and the corridor is continued here. And you got exactly the same in the sandstones. So the same sensitivity to the lithology, same size, same everything, except that this one is early and this one is late. So you got the take-home message already. Now, how is it in the reservoirs? So to really understand how it works with the fractures in the reservoir, I studied an analog very close to a field in Albania. The question was, what matters for fluids in the naturally fractured rocks? What matters, really? What should the people take into consideration when they make reservoir models? At what scale? And when do they occur in the petroleum kitchen? So these are bitumen floating at the surface in Albania along fractures. So in Albania, we are here. So this is Italy, and we are here in close to subduction in the fourth and first belt. So the studied area is here with a huge ramp, yeah, and we have some Jurassic and Cretaceous folded, and some tertiary on top. The small scale structure of the area is this one. I have some quarries here, and there's a well here, which is reaching a huge, one of the biggest reservoirs onshore in Europe. And the question is, how will be the reservoir, but also the question was, how should we prepare the drilling, because they were suspecting fractured corridors and a lot of problems. So they need to know in advance which will be the big structures to prepare the drilling, and also what should they expect underground. The rocks are Upper Cretaceous and Eocene Oligocene rocks. I've studied all these rocks. These are the quarries. The borehole would be the well. The well would be somewhere here at the bottom. So it's really not far from the well. And I studied this quarry also here along the road, and this one. So you see it's very big. This is 400 meters. First study is a systematic fracture survey, but it's much bigger than the natural outcrops. So we did an automatic fracture survey with pictures and with portable LiDAR and with a drone. So the quarries were surveyed entirely with a drone. And so my PhD student, Paul Namongo, wrote a code named FracABut, and with a survey on such a fracture, we can calculate the fracture count, different type of fractures. So the colors correspond to bed-confined fractures or multi-bed fractures, and it depends on the tip of the fracture. Either they have both tip on the bed interface, or they have one of their tip on the bed interface, or no tip on the bed interface. So this is the colors. These are percentage, and you see that half of the fracture are pink, that means this type, that means bed confined. And the other ones are mostly bed confined and a little bit are crossing. That means that fracture will not connect different beds, except some of them from time to time. And from this counting of fracture, we can decipher the capability of the bed interface to stop the fractures. So either the interface here will stop all fracture or not. The capacity to stop something is the impedance. If the capacity is strong, you stop everything, you have a strong impedance. And from the impedance, you can calculate the transmissivity. When the bed interface stops everything, there's no transmission of the fluid from one bed to another one. And this is what is calculated here. The bedding impedance of fractures coming from bottom to top, and the bed impedance of fractures coming from top to bottom. And the dots are the ratio. So this is a kind of study we did all around the quarries. And we obtained, well, more than this, but this is a sample. We obtained this kind of analysis that show that all types of fractures occur everywhere. We have all type of fractures wherever we go. About 3/4 of the fractures are bed confined. Only 1/4 is multi-bed. So only 1/4 of the fracture will participate to the connection and the permeability all along the reservoir. And within the fractures, a quarter to half is bed confined. That means this kind with both tips on the interface. Then we were studying the fractures to wonder how it works. So we saw that the fractures are abutting against stylolites, sometimes not against the bedding. So when the bedding is a gentle transition, it does not stop the fractures. The fractures are burial because they are stopped by stylolites. In some places, they have bitumen in the fractures and in the stylolites, and you can also have cement in the stylolites. That means that stylolites are porous and permeable. So stylolites are not at all the same. We observed also this is a map view of a sample view from top with perpendicular fractures. And I printed it and I cut a piece of paper and I was trying to restore the fractures to see which one is first. And there was no way to solve the problem. The answer was that they are synchronous. So this is another clue that you can have both types of fractures synchronously. That means that the flow will be in any direction, not only in one direction in the reservoir. Then, about the fracture filling. You see this is a small fracture, and the orange is the calcite, and the black is porosity. That means that the fractures, they can be largely opened, but they can be completely closed by cements, or you can keep residual porosity, and you can have pieces of porosity which are not connected. So the width of the fracture is not synonymous to the fracture porosity. And here you have a horizontal fracture. This is one bed, this is another one. So we have fractures opened at bed interfaces. And these fractures are cemented, and there is a remnant porosity also in these fractures. So what can we do with that? So these are the vertical and horizontal fractures. And in this example, I saw that the vertical and the horizontal are linked. So it's only one phase. With one stress pattern, we open vertical and horizontal fractures. It's a big problem to me to explain this. And so in these fractures, we may have remnant porosity. and the remnant porosity may be filled by bitumen or oil or by cement. Here you have cement filled inside the fractures. So that means that there's a communication with the top and with the bottom, with the fluids. 1 hour. Okay, I go faster. I skip this one. So now, how can we fit the fractures with the larger structures? So these are the large structures at the scale of the outcrop. We have here the fold hinge with the horizontal limb here and the vertical limb here. And another hinge here with horizontal again. So horizontal, vertical, and horizontal. We are here, horizontal, vertical, and subhorizontal. And these are the quarries, 5 and 4. So in all the quarries, we have seen that the fractures are reactivated as track slip later than fractures. We have seen that in the beds, in the vertical limb, we have early reverse faults, small reverse faults that developed before folding. We have seen that all the fractures which are here are tilted. So this is the same picture but tilted. So the fractures formed before folding. The fractures are affected here by back thrust. So this is the main fold, and these are back thrust coming from the depths. And the fractures, they really cut, the reverse faults, they really cut all the fractures. What I saw also is that the bed confined fractures, which you see here, close to the main track slip fault, they link together and they form highly persistent areas of damage zone, kind of small damage zone. So the early fracture will become highly permeable and highly porous zones after the folding. We saw also that there are huge track slip faults. This is this one that cut the fold. We have here the hinge, and the fold is cut by faults with more than 200 meters of displacement. And now all these structures, so there are north-south reverse faults, there are track slip east-west, track slip like this, there's the fold axis, and also track slip like this. Well, it makes different trends, and the point is that the fractures in the quarry trend exactly the same. So the trends of the fractures gave the trends of the larger structures. Why? Because the fractures formed very early. So they were all there when this formed. So they forced all the later structures to follow their trend. So large structure trend match early burial trends. That means that all is reactivation. And then I put all that on a loading pass. So this is the sequence with who is cutting who, and I could put them in the burial period and then the tectonic inversion. So now what is important for reservoirs? In this history, what will be important is the setup of diffuse fractures for the permeability. We have the bitumen or the oil at depths that imbibe the reservoir at that time. And then we have the large vertical corridor that will cut everything and create highways for fluids. So fluids can escape. And then we have the large fold with the large folds. So there will be also very large connecting drains for fluids. So I put all that on a kind of table where here's the size. This is a small scale features and the large scale features. These are fracture facies. These are facies of the rocks. So we have slumps. These are small fractures, small, medium, and bigger ones. These are faults. small, cast, reverse folds, and so on. And this is the folding. So we have slumps, we have early ramps, and we have the main anticline. So depending on the time, we can decipher which will be the size of the structure. And for instance, if this one is, for instance, this one, when this is the main highway for fluids, we know that this one will occur here. So in the reservoir here at the time of inhibition, there was no highway for fluids. That's it. What now? What next? So this will be my last slide. So at the moment, I'm working on a project where I want to link the fracture facies to the lithologic to the stratigraphic log. So there's a genetic link between the pattern of the fracture and the mechanical stratigraphy. I want to find quantification, and I want to fit it exactly in the carbonates, because we've seen that in the carbonates, it's not a linear correlation between bed thickness and fracture spacing. And the idea is to have a kind of survey of the fractures with the impedance and a survey of the lithostratigraphic scale. And the idea is to quantify the stratigraphic changes and the shape and how it evolves. So when we can link them, we add lithology, mechanics, geodynamics, petrophysical. We make a big soup with that. And for each case, we can have a kind of identity curve. So we can have curves that link the stratonomy with the fracture pattern. So that would be a kind of template catalog with any kind of output in any context. And what for? The application will be to quantify the connectivity and permeability in underground reservoirs. For instance, you have a log or BHI, and with the BHI, you can calculate the stratonomy curve. And the stratonomy curve may fit with one of the templates in the catalog. And from this, you could directly estimate the connectivity pattern due to the fractures, even without measuring one single fracture in the BHI. Oh, but I would lose my job if we don't measure fractures anymore. At the moment, this is done. This is on a good way, and this is not done because I still have to find many outcrops in different facies and different conditions. And so the green light here is the PhD of my student who published a paper already on this automatic quantification. I was speaking about it in previous slides, where we can have a very fast and convenient map of fractures. And from this diagram, we calculate the impedance of the bed interfaces. That means how far a bed boundary can stop the fractures. And the idea is then to input this in discrete fracture models. So we can create a grid on the stratigraphy of the rocks, and then we input the impedance in the grid. So each bed will have impedance at the top and the bottom, and then we can calculate fractures and permeability in the reservoir models. The idea also at the moment is to upscale. So this is still a challenge. So going from the very little observation to the reservoir scale, and combining this approach with the upscaling is what I try to do. So I use photogrammetric models. We use the data, a huge data set with the Fracabut system, and then we make 3D models. We make 3D models, so structural models, DFN models, and then with different scales, we calculate the permeability. And the idea is to homogenize the permeability that we have with very coarse models and the one we have with very high resolution models. So this is the way. And finally, the last way of future is the development of virtual reality fieldwork. So this is a real picture from the field in Oman, and this is the virtual reality picture. So we cannot access that place. It's too complicated and it's too big. So with the virtual reality, we can now do a structural mapping, and we can also collaborate with other people in the world to create models. And the next step will be to do DFN models directly in the virtual reality. And now it's your turn to speak and ask me questions if you have some questions.
So, thanks, obrigado, Juliette. Alguém uma pergunta? Hilário, por favor. How do you define fractal corridors? Do you quantify them or just you identify them looking on the output?
So the first reflex we have is look at them, but then we quantified it with skylines, and I can send you a paper on that. So there's no rule, there's no definition like over a threshold, it's a corridor or not. But then it's up to you to define it. You can say, okay, I use the shadow zone theory, and once fractures are closer than the thickness of the bed, it's a corridor. But that's not enough, because the corridor is really localized and it's quite narrow to what is around. And what we did with Sophie Wieser, the girl who's doing the modeling with me, is a small code or calculation you can use with the software pour la photogrammétrie. Cloud Compare, yeah, you can use it with Cloud Compare. Is a calculation of the slope of the distance between fractures. So you calculate the distance between fractures, and you plot them on a diagram where you have the number of the fracture and the cumulative distance, and then you will have slopes. And then with ascendant hierarchical analysis, we calculate how close to each other are the slopes, and then you define where will be the threshold where you cut the value that the slope is different, and then you can localize the corridors. And it happens that sometimes in Italy or in other places we have corridors, normal fracture patterns, and areas where we miss fractures. But I can send you the paper. But there's no rule. There's no rule.
Juliette, for the fracture corridors in the quite specific sectors, like the one that you showed that are not related to fold or to faults.
Yeah.
The one which are, for example, the
perpendicular
orthogonal and the perpendicular one. In this case.
What's your question?
No, it's not a question. I'm just saying that the anomaly to approach and studying these fracture corridors is specified and focused to the one that are not directly correlated to faults.
Ones which are buoyant.
But the one that are still not so well explained from the scientific
because corridors due to faults or folds, they are quite well known, and the people from the oil company, they know that they will be there. Their problems is the corridors in places where there's no tectonic deformation, very intense, and they do not expect them, but they are here, they are there. So why?
How you can explain the fractures that have both they're perpendicular, but you say that they are not by tectonics. So how can you explain that?
The horizontal ones.
Okay.
The horizontal ones or the vertical?
As you show that you have both fractures.
Yeah.
Both,
well, the theory would be that to open a fracture, you need a negative sigma 3. I think you need to really pull. But in fact, it's the same for the vertical ones. This is the huge difference between sigma 1 and sigma 2 and 3 that creates a relative extension. So it could be that, for instance, with a little bit less loading, a little bit of erosion or whatever, you have a slight reduction of sigma 1, and then sigma 3 will be relatively bigger. So what matters in this case is not the value of the strain, of the stress, but the difference between the maximum and the minimum. That means the shape of the ellipsoid. So if you have a finger shape, sigma 1 is so bigger than the 2 and the 3 that 2 could be equal to 3. Or if you have quite homogeneous one, when you reduce a little bit sigma 1 vertical, then the sigma 3 becomes relatively much bigger. So this is the shape of the ellipsoid that may create this.
I don't know the question.
You are the moderator.
Okay,
That's something like it. It's just to see if I understood about a corridor. We can we consider corridor just a specific area where the abundance or index of preference is bigger than just
Yes. Yes.
Independent of scale or
Yes, exactly.
when a specific area
And
has
it's kind
a
of wall.
density of preference higher than the
Yes, it's a kind of wall. And what's funny, is there a pencil?
I don't know. Yes.
Yeah. What is funny is that in some places you have thick, massive rocks. Here you would have more weak rocks and other big rocks like this. Thank you. And we see big corridors here. Here nothing. And here big corridors. That means that we had a kind of shadow of stress. Like the stress shadow is this one here. And in the stiff rocks, the stress is such that it breaks. In the weak rocks, the behavior is such that it doesn't break, and here it breaks. So you have to imagine a kind of clothes or a rope or tissue around it. So it's not that there was no stress, it's just that the stress was not appropriate to create fractures in this type of rock. And also, generally, it's continuing up here. I cannot speak without drawing. So it's continuing that way, and sometimes it stops, and there's another one. Sometimes they join, sometimes they cross, like fractures at small scale.
Please.
I have one more question. You said that the previous research was sandstones with fractures that's different than carbonates, but we find some mechanical or scientific relationship between the type of the grain, like this fine grain, I have more practice of the fractures or not, because we work here in sandstones and with fracture corridors, and they are more intense.
Yeah.
You find grainstone than when you compare to the large grains. So you find the same or not.
So it depends also on the diagenesis.
Okay.
Yes, this is it. Yeah. Here, for instance, so it's an coarse sandstones here, and you have pipettes here, and this is more thin, almost shaly, and in pit beds, the fractures are more spaced, than in a small bed, and the area of the corridor is wider. And here, the area of the corridor is very small, sometimes only one fracture. But I've not done specific sampling for grain size or diagenesis. But that might be very interesting to compare with diagenesis and grain size and maybe porosity and other stuff like this. I didn't have, well, that was not the goal. That was not the goal.
What about the thickness of the wine?
The thickness of the bed?
Yes, because the control also, so you have more beddings in the yellow part. So I expect more fractures than when you compare to the orange.
More fractures here?
Yes.
Yes, but look, for instance, this one has a lot of fractures and not this one. So it's in the first order correlated, but with a lot of exceptions in detail, like every time in geology.
First of all, congratulations for presenting very much. I have a silly question. You showed them an image who has two types of cellulites, a barrier one and a tectonics one. And I'm curious about that. On the field, how can I recognize these two types? What's the main difference between them?
So it's structural analysis, because the barrier ones usually are is perpendicular to sigma 1. Okay, so the small peaks